In the annals of human cruelty, few names inspire the same visceral dread as Vlad III of Wallachia. While history remembers many tyrants for their conquests or political machinations, Vlad earned his place in infamy through something far more sinister: the methodical perfection of human suffering. His reign was not measured in territories gained or enemies defeated, but in the screams that echoed from his forests of the impaled. The man who would become known as Vlad the Impaler ruled during one of Europe's most turbulent periods, when the Ottoman Empire pressed relentlessly into Christian lands. Yet even in an age accustomed to brutality, Vlad's methods shocked both allies and enemies alike. He transformed punishment from mere justice into theatrical horror, turning execution into an art form of prolonged agony. What drove a man to such extremes? Was it madness, calculated strategy, or something darker still? The truth lies buried beneath centuries of legend and propaganda, where the line between monster and protector becomes impossibly blurred. This is not merely the story of a cruel ruler, but an exploration of how power, when unchecked by conscience, can transform a human being into something far worse than any fictional monster. To understand Vlad's cruelty, we must first understand his world, a realm where survival demanded brutality and where the weak were consumed by forces beyond their comprehension. Yet even by the standards of his time, Vlad's methods were unprecedented in their creativity and calculated horror. His legacy would eventually inspire literature's most famous vampire, but the real Vlad Dracula was far more terrifying than any fictional creation. The story that unfolds is not for the faint of heart. It's a journey into the darkest corners of human nature, where political necessity meets pathological sadism, and where the pursuit of power transforms a man into history's most innovative architect of suffering. The year was 1448, when a 17-year-old prince first claimed the throne of Wallachia, a small principality caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. This was not merely a political appointment, it was a death sentence disguised as an honor. Wallachia existed as a buffer state, constantly pressured to choose sides in conflicts that would determine the fate of Eastern Europe. Previous rulers had learned that neutrality was impossible. Survival required picking the strongest ally and hoping they would honor their promises. Vlad III Dracula, his surname meaning son of the dragon, inherited this impossible position from his father, Vlad II Dracul, who had himself struggled to maintain Wallachia's precarious independence. The young prince had spent his formative years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, a common practice to ensure loyalty from vassal states. There, among the Turks, he witnessed firsthand the methods of imperial control, swift, brutal, and absolutely decisive. The Ottoman Empire did not rule through love or respect, but through the certainty that disobedience meant death. During his captivity, Vlad observed how the Ottomans used fear as a tool of governance. Public executions were not merely justice, they were theater designed to break the will of potential rebels. The young prince learned that mercy was often interpreted as weakness, and that sometimes the most effective way to prevent greater bloodshed was to commit acts so terrible that none would dare challenge your authority again. These lessons would later manifest in ways that would shock even his Ottoman teachers. The political landscape of 15th century Eastern Europe was a chessboard where human lives were expendable pieces. Betrayal was commonplace, alliances shifted with each military campaign, and rulers who showed compassion rarely lived long enough to regret it. Vlad's father had been assassinated by his own nobles, and his elder brother had been tortured and buried alive by Hungarian forces. These experiences taught the young prince that in his world there were only two types of people: those who inspired absolute terror and those who became victims. When Vlad finally secured his throne in 1456, he inherited a realm ravaged by civil war, threatened by foreign invasion, and populated by nobles who had murdered his father. The traditional response would have been political maneuvering, careful alliance building, and gradual consolidation of power. Instead, Vlad chose a different path, one that would ensure his name would be whispered in fear for centuries to come. He would not merely punish his enemies, he would transform punishment itself into an instrument of psychological warfare so effective that the mere mention of his name would end rebellions before they began. The method that would define Vlad's reign and earn him his terrible epithet was impalement. But this was no crude execution technique. Under Vlad's direction, impalement became a refined art of prolonged suffering, carefully calibrated to maximize both physical agony and psychological impact. The process began with the selection of stakes, which were deliberately fashioned to be blunt rather than sharp. A pointed stake would cause death too quickly. Vlad's stakes were designed to penetrate the body slowly, allowing victims to live for hours or even days while suspended in unimaginable pain. The victim would be forced onto the stake, which was then inserted through the body with surgical precision. The most common method involved penetration through the rectum, with the stake carefully guided to avoid vital organs during its initial passage. The stake would then be raised upright, allowing gravity to slowly draw the victim downward, the wood gradually working its way through the body cavity. Death would eventually come from blood loss, organ failure, or shock, but not before hours of conscious suffering that could be heard across great distances. Vlad's executioners became masters of their craft, able to position stakes so that they would emerge from different parts of the body, sometimes through the chest, sometimes through the mouth, occasionally through the shoulder or back. Each variation produced different types of suffering and different time frames for death. The most skilled executioners could ensure that victims remained conscious and aware throughout most of the process, able to contemplate their fate and call out warnings to others who might witness their agony. The psychological impact of impalement extended far beyond the immediate victim. Vlad would often arrange his impaled victims in geometric patterns visible from great distances, forests of dying humanity that served as monuments to his power. Merchants traveling trade routes would encounter these displays days after the executions, when decomposition had begun, but many victims were still alive. The sight, smell, and sound of these human gardens created trauma that spread far beyond Wallachhia's borders, establishing Vlad's reputation throughout Europe. But impalement was only the beginning of Vlad's repertoire. Historical records document his use of flaying, where victims were skinned alive with instruments designed to remove flesh in strips while preserving life. He employed boiling, where prisoners were slowly lowered into cauldrons of oil or water, heated to specific temperatures that would cause maximum pain without immediate death. Crushing devices were used to break bones systematically, starting with extremities and working inward, allowing victims to anticipate each stage of their destruction while remaining conscious throughout the process. The most documented episode of Vlad's cruelty occurred in 1459, when he invited the noble families of Târgoviște to an Easter feast. These were the same aristocrats who had conspired in his father's murder and had spent decades playing political games that weakened Wallachia. Vlad's invitation appeared to be a gesture of reconciliation, a new ruler seeking to make peace with the established order. The nobles arrived in their finest clothing, bringing their families and expecting a celebration that would mark the beginning of a new era of cooperation. During the feast, as wine flowed and conversations turned jovial, Vlad rose to address his guests. He spoke eloquently about forgiveness, unity, and the future of Wallachia. Then, at a predetermined signal, his guards sealed the doors and began the arrest of every person in the hall. The elderly nobles were impaled immediately, their deaths serving as a warm-up for the more elaborate punishments that followed. The younger nobles and their families were forced to march to Castle Dracula, where they would spend the remainder of their lives as slave laborers, building the fortress that would become Vlad's primary stronghold. Contemporary accounts describe how Vlad personally supervised the impalement of the elderly nobles, adjusting the angle and positioning of stakes to ensure optimal suffering. He reportedly dined among the dying men, commenting on their expressions and making jokes about their reduced circumstances. Witnesses noted that he seemed to derive genuine pleasure from their agony, occasionally pausing his meal to offer mockingly sympathetic words to his victims or to critique the technique of his executioners. The forced march to Castle Dracula became its own form of torture. Noble families who had lived lives of luxury were driven through mountain passes in their feast clothing, forced to work without rest until they collapsed from exhaustion. Many died during the construction of the castle, their bodies incorporated into the foundation as a symbolic gesture. Those who survived the initial construction were kept as permanent prisoners, their noble titles becoming cruel jokes as they performed the most menial labor under constant threat of impalement. This single event eliminated an entire generation of Wallachian nobility and sent a message throughout the region that traditional political protections no longer existed under Vlad's rule. The story spread rapidly through diplomatic channels, reaching courts in Hungary, Poland, and even Western Europe. Foreign ambassadors began to approach Wallachia with unprecedented caution, aware that diplomatic immunity might not protect them from a ruler who had demonstrated such creative disregard for established customs and social hierarchies. Foreign merchants and diplomats provided some of the most detailed accounts of Vlad's methods, as they were often spared execution in order to spread word of what they had witnessed. A German merchant named Jacob Rehm described arriving at Târgoviște to find the central square transformed into what he called a forest of the dying. Hundreds of stakes had been arranged in concentric circles, with victims in various stages of decay and death. The smell was so overwhelming that horses refused to enter the city, and Rehm's party was forced to conduct their business while breathing through cloth soaked in wine and herbs. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and one of history's most ruthless military leaders, reportedly turned back from an invasion of Wallachia after encountering a field containing 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners. The Sultan, who had witnessed countless atrocities during his campaigns, was said to have remarked that he could not make war against a man who surpassed the devil himself in cruelty. This retreat by one of Europe's most feared military commanders served to enhance Vlad's reputation and demonstrated that his methods were effective even against the most hardened warriors. A Hungarian diplomat named Toma Cantacuzénos left detailed records of a dinner invitation at Castle Dracula, where he was forced to dine while watching freshly impaled prisoners die outside the dining hall windows. Vlad reportedly asked his guest whether the smell bothered him, and when Cantacuzénos admitted it did, Vlad offered to have him impaled higher up, where the air might be fresher. The diplomat realized this was not entirely a joke, and spent the remainder of the meal praising the effectiveness of Vlad's justice system. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from a Saxon chronicler who described Vlad's treatment of captured Ottoman soldiers. Rather than simply executing them, Vlad would select a few to be released unharmed, ensuring they would return to Ottoman territory with detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. These survivors became unwilling ambassadors of terror, their testimonies more effective than any military victory in discouraging future invasions. The psychological warfare was so effective that some Ottoman commanders began avoiding Wallachian territory entirely, choosing longer routes that bypassed Vlad's domain. The consistency of these foreign accounts, despite coming from different time periods and various cultural backgrounds, suggests that the reports of Vlad's cruelty were not merely propaganda or exaggerated legends. The details provided by witnesses from Germany, Hungary, Turkey, and other regions align too closely to be dismissed as fabrication. These men had seen warfare, execution, and the casual brutality common to their era, yet they all described Vlad's methods as uniquely horrifying, suggesting that his cruelty exceeded even the brutal norms of 15th century Europe. Vlad's reign of terror was not random violence, but a calculated system designed to achieve specific political objectives. His cruelty served multiple purposes: eliminating domestic opposition, deterring foreign invasion, and establishing a reputation that would make future conflicts unnecessary. In an era when military strength was often determined by the size of armies and the wealth of treasuries, Vlad discovered that reputation alone could be more effective than conventional power. His methods were theatrical, because the theater itself was the weapon. The systematic nature of Vlad's violence becomes clear when examining his treatment of different social classes and ethnic groups. Boyars who challenged his authority faced the most elaborate punishments, their suffering designed to demonstrate the futility of political opposition. Foreign merchants who cheated or showed disrespect were punished in ways that would be remembered and reported throughout the trading networks of Eastern Europe. Religious minorities and ethnic groups perceived as disloyal faced collective punishment designed to ensure community compliance. Vlad's use of impalement as a primary execution method was particularly strategic. Unlike hanging or beheading, which were quick and could be ignored by distant observers, impalement created long-lasting displays that served as permanent warnings. The victims remained visible for weeks, their decomposing bodies serving as monuments to Vlad's power long after the initial punishment. Travelers encountering these displays days or weeks later would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, spreading Vlad's reputation far beyond his realm's borders. The economic impact of Vlad's methods was substantial and intentional. By eliminating corrupt merchants through spectacular punishments, he temporarily reduced trade corruption and increased tax revenues. By terrorizing potential rebels into submission, he reduced the costs associated with maintaining large standing armies or building extensive fortifications. The fear he generated functioned as an invisible army, patrolling his borders and maintaining order without requiring payment or supplies. However, the long-term consequences of Vlad's approach proved problematic. While his methods were initially effective in consolidating power and deterring enemies, they also created a climate of paranoia that made normal governance nearly impossible. Subordinates were too frightened to provide honest counsel. Allies remained unreliable due to fear of eventual betrayal, and the general population lived in constant anxiety about arbitrary punishment. The system that had granted Vlad absolute power also isolated him completely, making him dependent on fear as his only tool of governance. The most notorious incident in Vlad's reign occurred in 1462, when he invited a group of Ottoman ambassadors to his court under the pretense of diplomatic negotiations. These were not mere messengers, but high-ranking officials representing Sultan Mehmed II, sent to demand increased tribute payments and discuss terms for Walachia's continued vassalage. The ambassadors arrived, expecting the usual diplomatic protocols: formal ceremonies, negotiated agreements, and the subtle dance of international relations that characterized medieval diplomacy. When the Ottoman delegation refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, claiming religious obligations, Vlad appeared to accept their explanation graciously. He told the ambassadors that since their turbans were so important to them, he would ensure they never had to remove them again. The diplomats likely interpreted this as a respectful accommodation of their religious practices. Instead, Vlad ordered his guards to nail the turbans directly to the ambassadors' skulls using long iron spikes, permanently attaching the headwear to their heads. The ambassadors were then impaled while still wearing their spiked turbans, their deaths serving as Vlad's official response to Ottoman diplomatic demands. But the horror did not end with their execution. Vlad ordered the bodies to be displayed prominently along the main road leading to Ottoman territory, positioned so that other diplomatic missions would encounter them before reaching the Wallachian court. The message was unmistakable. Diplomatic immunity held no meaning in Vlad's domain. This incident marked a definitive break in Vlad's relationship with the Ottoman Empire and demonstrated his willingness to violate the most basic principles of international law. The murder of ambassadors was considered one of the gravest possible offenses in medieval diplomacy, an act that justified immediate military retaliation and marked the perpetrator as an enemy of civilized nations. Vlad's decision to not only kill the ambassadors, but to do so in such a spectacular manner indicated that he had moved beyond rational political calculation into a realm of pure psychological warfare. The Ottoman response was swift and overwhelming. Sultan Mehmed II, who had previously been content to collect tribute from Wallachia, now committed substantial military resources to Vlad's destruction. The ambassador incident had transformed a manageable political relationship into a personal vendetta between two of history's most ruthless leaders. The resulting conflict would push Vlad's methods to even greater extremes and ultimately contribute to his downfall. As Ottoman forces advanced into Wallachia in 1462, Vlad implemented what military historians now recognize as one of history's most extreme scorched earth campaigns. Rather than simply destroying resources to deny them to the enemy, Vlad transformed his own territory into a landscape of psychological horror designed to break the morale of invading forces. Villages were not merely burned, but were repopulated with impaled residents, creating the appearance of normal settlements that revealed their true nature only upon close approach. The retreating Wallachian forces left behind carefully staged scenes of atrocity at regular intervals along the Ottoman advance route. Wells were poisoned not just with traditional toxins, but with the decomposing bodies of impaled victims, ensuring that even the water supplies carried visual reminders of Vlad's power. Granaries were filled with mutilated corpses instead of grain, and what appeared to be food supplies from a distance revealed themselves to be elaborate displays of human remains, arranged to maximize psychological impact. Vlad's most audacious act during this campaign was a night attack on the Ottoman camp, targeting not the military leadership or strategic positions, but the Sultan's personal tent. The attack was not designed to achieve military victory. Vlad's small force could never defeat the massive Ottoman army in direct combat. Instead, the raid was pure psychological warfare, intended to demonstrate that even the most powerful ruler in the world was not safe from Vlad's reach. The attack failed to kill or capture Mehmed II, but it succeeded in its true purpose, proving that conventional military superiority meant nothing against an enemy willing to abandon all rules of engagement. During the retreat from the failed night attack, Vlad's forces captured several hundred Ottoman soldiers. Rather than holding them as prisoners for potential exchange or ransom, Vlad ordered their immediate impalement along the road leading back to the main Ottoman camp. The victims were positioned so that their cries could be heard by the advancing Ottoman forces, who were forced to march past their dying comrades while listening to their pleas for help. Some Ottoman soldiers reportedly deserted rather than continue advancing through what they described as the devil's own country. Bedi. The cumulative effect of these tactics was exactly what Vlad had intended. Even though his military forces were vastly outnumbered, the Ottoman advance slowed dramatically as commanders struggled to maintain discipline among troops who were witnessing horrors that exceeded anything in their military experience. Supply lines became unreliable as support personnel refused to venture into Wallachian territory, and recruitment for the campaign became increasingly difficult as word spread throughout the Ottoman Empire about the nature of warfare in Vlad's domain. The final phase of Vlad's reign demonstrated how his methods, while initially effective, ultimately proved self-destructive. By 1462, his cruelty had eliminated most of his domestic support base, alienated potential foreign allies, and created a climate of fear so pervasive that normal governance became impossible. The boyars who might have provided administrative expertise were dead or in exile. The merchants who could have generated tax revenue were too frightened to conduct business, and the common people lived in constant terror of arbitrary punishment. Vlad's isolation became complete when even his Hungarian allies began to view him as a liability rather than an asset. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had previously supported Vlad as a useful buffer against Ottoman expansion, began receiving reports from his own ambassadors describing atrocities that exceeded any military necessity. The Hungarian court realized that Vlad's reputation was beginning to reflect poorly on his Christian allies, making diplomatic relations with other European powers increasingly difficult. The end came not through military defeat, but through political abandonment. In 1462, Vlad was captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned for 12 years, not as punishment for his crimes, but as a political necessity. His continued freedom had become incompatible with Hungary's broader diplomatic objectives, and his methods had made him too dangerous to remain as an ally. The imprisonment was presented as protective custody rather than punishment. But the message was clear. Even Vlad's supporters could no longer tolerate his presence in active politics. During his imprisonment, stories of Vlad's cruelty continued to spread throughout Europe, taking on increasingly legendary characteristics. German printing presses produced pamphlets describing his atrocities, often embellished for dramatic effect but based on documented accounts from surviving witnesses. These publications marked the beginning of Vlad's transformation from historical figure to cultural symbol, the real man disappearing behind a mythology of absolute evil that would eventually inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula centuries later. When Vlad briefly returned to power in 1476, his methods remained unchanged, but his effectiveness had diminished. The world had adapted to his tactics, and his reputation, while still fearsome, no longer carried the paralyzing effect it had once possessed. His death in battle later that year marked the end of an era in which a single individual's commitment to cruelty had shaped the political landscape of an entire region. The man who had ruled through terror died as he had lived, violently, surrounded by enemies, and without the loyalty of those he had sought to protect. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler extends far beyond the borders of 15th century Wallachia, influencing literature, political theory, and our understanding of power's corrupting potential. His methods demonstrated that cruelty, when systematically applied, could achieve short-term political objectives, but at the cost of long-term stability and moral legitimacy. Modern dictators have studied Vlad's techniques, recognizing in his reign both the potential effectiveness and ultimate futility of governing through fear alone. The transformation of Vlad from historical figure to literary character reflects humanity's complex relationship with absolute evil. Bram Stoker's Dracula drew inspiration from the historical Vlad, but transformed him into a supernatural monster, perhaps because the reality of his human cruelty was too disturbing to confront directly. The vampire Dracula is frightening because he is inhuman. The historical Vlad is terrifying precisely because he demonstrates what humans are capable of when power is unchecked by conscience or consequence. Psychological studies of Vlad's documented behavior suggest a complex interaction between strategic calculation and pathological sadism. While many of his actions served clear political purposes, the elaborate nature of his tortures and his apparent personal enjoyment of others' suffering indicate motivations that transcended mere political necessity. His case has become a subject of study for researchers investigating the psychology of political violence and the conditions that transform rational actors into agents of systematic cruelty. The historical records of Vlad's reign serve as documentation of humanity's capacity for both inflicting and surviving extreme suffering. The accounts left by survivors provide insight into the psychological mechanisms that allow individuals to endure unimaginable torture, while the testimonies of witnesses reveal how communities adapt to living under the constant threat of arbitrary violence. These records have proven valuable to modern researchers studying trauma, resilience, and the long-term effects of political terror on human societies. Perhaps most significantly, Vlad's story illustrates the paradox of effective cruelty. While his methods achieved their immediate objectives of consolidating power and deterring enemies, they also created the conditions that ultimately led to his downfall. The fear that made him powerful also made him isolated. The reputation that protected him also made him politically toxic. And the methods that eliminated his enemies also destroyed the social structures necessary for stable governance. His reign serves as a historical case study in the self-limiting nature of power based entirely on fear and the inevitable consequences of abandoning moral constraints in the pursuit of political objectives. In examining the life and methods of Vlad the Impaler, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the corrupting influence of absolute power. His story forces us to consider whether the capacity for such elaborate cruelty exists within all of us, waiting for the right combination of circumstances, opportunity, and justification to emerge. The historical record suggests that Vlad was not born a monster, but was shaped by his experiences into something monstrous, raising disturbing questions about the malleability of human conscience under extreme conditions. The effectiveness of Vlad's methods even as we recoil from their brutality, challenges our assumptions about morality and political necessity. His reign achieved its stated objectives. Domestic opposition was eliminated, foreign invasions were deterred, and political stability was maintained for over a decade. Yet the cost of this success was measured not only in the lives of his victims, but in the destruction of the social bonds and moral frameworks that make civilized society possible. His legacy asks us to consider whether any political objective can justify the deliberate infliction of such suffering, and whether power maintained through fear can ever be truly legitimate. The story of Vlad the Impaler serves as a warning about the fragility of the moral constraints that separate civilization from barbarism. In our modern world, where technology has made both surveillance and violence more efficient than ever before, his methods remind us that the capacity for systematic cruelty remains present in human societies. The same organizational skills, technological innovation, and psychological insight that he applied to torture could easily be adapted to serve similar purposes in contemporary contexts. Perhaps most troubling is the recognition that Vlad's cruelty was not the product of madness or irrationality, but of a clear-eyed assessment of political reality. His methods worked because he understood human psychology better than his contemporaries, recognizing that fear could be more effective than affection, that reputation could substitute for military strength, and that the threat of extreme punishment could maintain order more efficiently than complex legal systems. This calculated nature of his cruelty makes it more rather than less frightening, as it suggests that such methods could be deliberately chosen by rational actors who conclude that the benefits outweigh the moral costs. The enduring fascination with Vlad's story, from medieval chronicles to modern horror films, reflects our need to grapple with these uncomfortable realities about power, violence, and human nature. By examining his reign in detail, we honor the memory of his victims while learning valuable lessons about the conditions that allow such figures to emerge and the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even in the face of political necessity. His story reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would trade human dignity for political expedience, and that the capacity for both great evil and great resistance to evil lies within us all.